Standing at my home office window on this quiet Tuesday morning, I stare out at the spot where it all began. Parking space number 47 sits empty now, a patch of asphalt that once served as the battlefield for the most intense neighborhood war I've ever experienced. The morning sun casts long shadows across Willowbrook Heights, and everything looks peaceful. Deceptively peaceful. 1 year ago, Sandra Morrison ruled this community with an iron fist, wielding HOA regulations like weapons against anyone who dared challenge her authority. Today she's gone, vanished, just like I promised her car would be. The irony isn't lost on me. I'm sitting here in my perfectly organized office, sipping coffee from a mug that reads, "World's okayest homeowner," trying to process what I accomplished, or what I became in the process. The neighbors still whisper about what happened to Sandra Morrison. Some say I'm a hero who freed them from a tyrant. Others cross the street when they see me coming, afraid of what I might be capable of. I suppose they're both right. My reflection is interrupted by the sound of small feet running up my driveway. 8-year-old Emma from next door appears at my window, her face pressed against the glass with that curious expression kids get when they're about to ask something that will make adults uncomfortable. I open the window, and she immediately launches into her question. "Mr. Ryan, my mum said you made the mean lady's car disappear forever. Did you use magic? Or did you eat her like the monsters in my storybooks?" The innocence in her voice cuts through me like a knife. I force a smile and tell her that sometimes grown-ups have disagreements, and Mrs. Morrison decided to move away. But Emma's question lingers in the air long after she skips back to her yard. Have I become the monster in someone else's story? The thought follows me as I walk to my mailbox, where I find an unmarked envelope with no return address. Inside, there's a single sheet of paper with typed words that make my blood run cold. "You think you won? Look deeper." No signature, no clue who sent it. Just a reminder that even victory can have shadows. I close my eyes and let my mind drift back to where it all started. Back to when I was just Michael Ryan, a 42-year-old software engineer who thought the biggest problem in his life was debugging code. Back to when I believed that following the rules and being reasonable would solve any conflict. How naive I was. How completely unprepared for Sandra Morrison and her particular brand of neighborhood terrorism. Let me tell you exactly how a simple dispute over patio furniture turned into the most calculated revenge I've ever executed. It started with 2 handmade wooden chairs. Nothing fancy, just a simple project I'd completed in my garage workshop during a particularly stressful month at work. I'd placed them on my front porch, angled perfectly to catch the evening sunset, positioned exactly 16 feet and 7 inches from the street curb. I'd measured twice because I actually read the HOA guidelines, unlike most of my neighbors who just signed the papers and hoped for the best. Those chairs represented something important to me. A small victory over the chaos of deadlines and conference calls, a peaceful spot where I could decompress after 12-hour coding sessions. 3 days later, I found the violation notice tucked under my windshield wiper like a parking ticket from hell. Violation notice number WH 2024-0847. Unauthorized outdoor furniture positioning violates Section 4.2.1 of Community Guidelines. Fine, $150. Repeat offense may result in legal action. The notice included a photograph of my chairs taken from an angle that made them appear larger and more intrusive than they actually were. Someone had clearly put effort into making my modest furniture look like an eyesore. When I called the HOA office, I was transferred 4 times before finally reaching Sandra Morrison herself. Her voice carried the kind of cold authority that makes you instinctively check if you've done something wrong. "Mr. Ryan," she said, drawing out my name like it left a bad taste in her mouth. "The rules are quite clear. We've measured your furniture placement, and it's in violation." I explained that I'd measured carefully and was well within the 15-foot minimum distance requirement. Her response was a laugh that held no humor whatsoever. "Mr. Ryan, I suggest you measure again. More carefully this time." That evening, I borrowed a laser measuring device from my neighbor Jim, a retired Marine who'd become something of a mentor figure in the neighborhood. The measurement confirmed what I already knew: 16 feet, 7 inches, well within the required distance. But when I looked around at other properties, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten with anger. Mrs. Peterson, who lived 3 houses down and was known to be Sandra's closest ally, had a large porch swing positioned just 12 feet from the curb. The Rodriguez family had an entire outdoor dining set that was clearly closer to the street than my 2 simple chairs. I spent the next week conducting my own investigation, walking the neighborhood with a notebook and measuring tape. What I discovered was a pattern so blatant it was almost insulting. Families that Sandra Morrison didn't like, and I could track her preferences through her social media activity, were cited for violations at a rate nearly 3 times higher than her favorites. The violations themselves were often questionable, sometimes outright fabricated. Tom Henderson got fined $200 for improperly storing his son's bicycle, which was simply leaning against his garage door. Lisa Wang received a citation for hanging Christmas lights 2 days before the approved decoration period. The online neighborhood forum painted an even clearer picture of Sandra's reign of terror. People were afraid to complain publicly, but private messages revealed a community living in fear. Mark Thompson told me Sandra had forced his family to repaint their entire house because the beige color was too yellow for community standards, costing them $3,000. Sarah Jenkins was cited for having a vegetable garden that was inconsistent with the aesthetic vision of the neighborhood. Each story added another layer to my growing understanding that Sandra Morrison wasn't enforcing rules. She was wielding them as weapons against anyone who didn't fit her narrow vision of suburban perfection. The second violation notice arrived exactly 1 week after the first, accompanied by another photograph that Sandra had clearly taken herself at 6:30 in the morning. Second notice: chairs remain in violation, additional fine, $200. Removal required within 48 hours or further action will be taken. The photo showed Sandra's shadow stretched across my driveway, proof that she was personally monitoring my property like some kind of suburban surveillance operative. That's when I realized this wasn't really about chairs or community guidelines. This was about power, control, and Sandra Morrison's need to dominate every aspect of life in Willowbrook Heights. Standing at my window that evening, watching Sandra's black BMW idling at the end of my driveway while she stared at my house, I felt something shift inside me. The reasonable part of my brain wanted to just remove the chairs and avoid further conflict. But a deeper part, the part that had been awakened by weeks of witnessing Sandra's systematic bullying of my neighbors, whispered something different. This wasn't just about my furniture anymore. This was about drawing a line in the sand and saying enough. I decided to attend the next HOA meeting and address this situation directly. Little did I know, I was walking straight into Sandra Morrison's trap. The Willowbrook Heights Community Center had never felt smaller than it did that Thursday evening in March. 47 families were represented in the cramped room, folding chairs arranged in neat rows, facing a long table where the HOA board sat like judges preparing to deliver verdicts. Sandra Morrison commanded the center position, wearing a red polo shirt embroidered with the HOA logo and white shorts that somehow managed to look official and intimidating. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail that seemed to stretch her face into a permanent expression of disapproval. She'd positioned herself to be the undisputed center of attention, and everyone in the room knew it. The meeting began with Sandra's monthly review of violations, a ritual that felt more like public shaming than community governance. She read each family's infractions aloud, complete with addresses and fine amounts, while the accused homeowners shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The Henderson family on Maple Street owes $300 for persistent garbage can violations. The Kim family on Oak Drive has failed to address their unauthorized fence height. Her voice carried the satisfaction of someone who genuinely enjoyed wielding power over others. When she reached my name, her tone sharpened with particular relish. Mr. Ryan's unauthorized seating arrangement continues to be our most flagrant violation this quarter. 47 pairs of eyes turned toward me like spotlights, and I felt the weight of community judgment pressing down on my shoulders. Some faces showed sympathy, others curiosity, and a few displayed the kind of relief that comes from watching someone else become the target. I stood up slowly, my folder of evidence feeling heavier than it should. "Mrs. Morrison," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "I've measured my chairs multiple times. They're positioned 16 feet and 7 inches from the curb, which exceeds your 15-foot requirement." The room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Sandra's smile was the kind that predators wear when they spot wounded prey. "Mr. Ryan, we've conducted professional measurements using calibrated equipment. Perhaps you need to invest in more accurate tools." A few people chuckled, though whether from nervousness or genuine amusement was impossible to tell. I reached into my folder and produced the photographs I'd taken with Jim's laser measuring device, holding them up for the room to see. "These photos show measurements taken with a construction-grade laser device. 16 feet, 7 inches. The regulation requires 15 feet minimum." My voice was gaining confidence as I presented my evidence, but Sandra's expression never wavered. "Mr. Ryan," she said, standing up to match my height, "are you questioning the authority and competence of this board?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. This wasn't a discussion about measurements anymore. This was a direct challenge to Sandra's authority, and everyone present understood the implications. I felt the moment balanced on a knife's edge, knowing that my next words would determine not just the outcome of this meeting, but my entire future relationship with this community. "I'm questioning the fairness and accuracy of selective enforcement," I replied, emphasizing each word carefully. What happened next revealed Sandra Morrison's true nature in all its calculated cruelty. She opened her laptop and projected an image onto the wall behind her, a screenshot that made my stomach lurch with recognition. "Since Mr. Ryan wants transparency," she announced with theatrical satisfaction, "let's examine his own record of community cooperation." The projection showed a complaint I'd filed 6 months earlier about excessive noise from Mrs. Peterson's late-night parties. It was confidential information that should never have been shared publicly. And Sandra knew it. This is the same neighbor who filed complaints about noise violations while simultaneously violating our furniture placement regulations. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. Not only had Sandra violated my privacy by sharing confidential HOA correspondence, but she'd done it with such casual cruelty that I realized she'd been planning this moment from the beginning. "Mrs. Morrison," I said, my voice beginning to shake with anger, "that information is confidential. You have no legal right to share private complaints in a public forum." But Sandra was ready for my objection, her smile widening as she delivered her killing blow. "Mr. Ryan, this board has the authority to disclose any information relevant to community harmony and individual compliance patterns." That's when the community center doors opened and 2 police officers walked in. Officer Martinez, a woman in her 30s with kind eyes but a serious expression, approached our little drama with professional caution. "We received a report about potentially disruptive behavior," she announced to the room. Sandra immediately stood and pointed in my direction. "Officers, thank you for responding so quickly. Mr. Ryan has been increasingly aggressive and has made several veiled threats during tonight's proceeding. The accusation hung in the air like poison gas, and I felt the entire room's perception of me shift in real time. Standing there with 2 police officers studying me while 47 neighbors watched in stunned silence, I experienced a moment of perfect clarity. Sandra Morrison hadn't just been enforcing arbitrary rules. She'd been systematically building a case to destroy my reputation and credibility. The furniture violations, the public shaming, the privacy breach, and now the police intervention. It was all choreographed to paint me as an unstable, threatening presence in the community. The officers spent 10 minutes confirming that no actual threats had been made before leaving, but the damage was already done. I was now the neighborhood troublemaker in the official record. Sandra's final move was the most devastating of all. "Effective immediately," she announced with the authority of a judge delivering a sentence. "Mr. Ryan's parking privileges are suspended pending a full investigation into his disruptive behavior patterns." I felt the words hit me like a sledgehammer. "You can't do that," I protested, hearing the desperation creeping into my voice. "I pay for that parking space. It's part of my monthly HOA fees." Sandra's response was delivered with the precision of someone who'd researched every possible legal angle. "I suggest you review Section 15.3 of your HOA contract, Mr. Ryan. Behavioral compliance is tied directly to community privileges." Walking out of that community center, I felt like I'd been stripped naked in front of my entire neighborhood. The parking lot felt like a gauntlet as I made my way to my car, avoiding eye contact with neighbors who might judge me or, worse, pity me. But the final insult was waiting for me at home. Sandra's black BMW was parked in my designated spot, the space I'd been paying for as part of my monthly HOA fees. Her vanity license plate read, "HOA Boss," and she'd positioned the car perfectly in the center of the space, like a conqueror planting a flag on captured territory. Standing there in the darkness, staring at that BMW, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. This wasn't about chairs or parking anymore. This was about dignity, justice, and whether I was going to let Sandra Morrison destroy everything I'd worked to build in this community. The first 24 hours after my public humiliation were the darkest I'd experienced since moving to Willowbrook Heights. I didn't sleep that night, instead spending the hours between 2 and 6 in the morning researching HOA law, property rights, and Sandra Morrison's background. What I discovered during those sleepless hours changed everything. Sandra had violated at least 12 procedural requirements during that meeting, including the illegal disclosure of confidential resident information and the improper suspension of parking privileges without board approval. More importantly, I learned that Sandra Morrison had a history that extended far beyond our little suburban community. My salvation came in the form of Jim Patterson, the retired Marine from down the street who'd lent me his measuring device. He appeared at my door at 7 in the morning carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the kind of expression that suggested he had something important to say. "Son," he said, settling into one of my controversial patio chairs. "I recorded that entire meeting last night. Sandra Morrison doesn't know it, but I've got every word of her performance on digital audio." The relief I felt was overwhelming, but Jim wasn't finished. More than that, I spent 20 years as a paralegal before I joined the service. What Sandra did last night wasn't just wrong, it was illegal. We spent the next week developing what Jim dubbed Operation Sunlight, a systematic investigation into Sandra Morrison's activities as HOA president. Our goal wasn't revenge or destruction, it was documentation and exposure. Jim's legal background proved invaluable as we requested financial records, meeting minutes, and procedural documents that were required to be available for community review. What we found was a pattern of financial irregularities that went far beyond simple incompetence. Sandra had approved $97,000 in expenditures over 8 months, most of them just under the $5,000 threshold that required board approval. The deeper we dug, the clearer Sandra's scheme became. She'd increased her own salary by 40% since taking office, justifying it as administrative complexity adjustments. $15,000 had been paid to Morrison Property Management, a company owned by her husband Mike, for consulting services that had no documentation or deliverables. $8,000 went toward landscape improvements that coincidentally focused on the area immediately around Sandra's own property. Each transaction was technically legal when viewed individually, but together they painted a picture of systematic self-dealing that bordered on embezzlement. My investigation into Sandra's background revealed an even more disturbing pattern. She'd been a real estate agent until 3 years earlier, when her license was revoked following ethics violations. Before joining our HOA, she'd served on the board of another community, where she was eventually sued for financial misconduct. The lawsuit was settled out of court, but the court documents told a familiar story of abuse of power and financial irregularities. Mike Morrison, her husband, had a history of tax liens and business failures that suggested the family was under significant financial pressure. Lisa Chen, an accountant who lived 2 streets over, agreed to help us analyze the financial documents after Jim vouched for our intentions. Her forensic examination revealed that Sandra had been systematically targeting families with high property values, using violations and fines to pressure them into expensive improvements that increased neighborhood property values. 5 families had sold their homes in the past 8 months, citing HOA harassment as their primary reason for leaving. Each of those properties had been purchased below market value by companies with connections to Mike Morrison's business network. The most damning evidence came from Sandra's own digital footprint. Her social media activity revealed a clear pattern of targeting families based on personal preferences rather than actual violations. She'd posted complaints about certain types of people who didn't understand community standards, while simultaneously praising families who shared her political and social views. The correlation between her personal opinions and violation patterns was so obvious that it would be impossible to deny discriminatory enforcement. Jim introduced me to Sarah Kim, a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes and civil rights violations. Her initial consultation cost $200, but her advice was invaluable. "You have a strong case for procedural violations and discriminatory enforcement," she told us, "but a civil lawsuit could cost $20,000 and take 2 years to resolve." She suggested a different approach, documenting everything for state authorities and criminal investigators who could pursue the case without requiring us to bankroll expensive litigation. We spent 3 weeks building what Jim called the file, a comprehensive dossier of Sandra's violations, financial irregularities, and discriminatory practices. The documentation included 47 pages of evidence, 8 audio recordings, video footage from my security camera showing Sandra's personal use of my parking space, and financial analysis proving systematic self-dealing. But our most powerful weapon was patience. Rather than confronting Sandra directly, we decided to let her continue believing she'd won while we built an airtight case for the authorities. The psychological aspect of our strategy was crucial. Sandra Morrison was drunk on power and convinced of her own invincibility. Every day that she used my parking space, every violation she issued to families she disliked, every dollar she funneled to her husband's companies, all of it was being documented and would eventually be used to destroy the empire she'd built. Jim taught me something important during those weeks. The best way to catch a bully is to let them think they're winning while you build the case that will bring them down. 2 weeks after the disastrous HOA meeting, I implemented the most difficult part of our strategy: complete surrender. At least that's what Sandra Morrison and the rest of Willowbrook Heights were meant to believe. I encountered Sandra at the community mailbox on a Tuesday morning, and instead of the angry confrontation she probably expected, I offered her a friendly smile and a cheerful greeting. "Good morning, Mrs. Morrison. Beautiful weather we're having, isn't it?" The confusion on her face was priceless, but she quickly recovered and responded with suspicious politeness. That evening, I composed and sent an email to the entire Willowbrook Heights mailing list that must have made Sandra feel like she'd achieved total victory. "Dear neighbors," I wrote, "I want to apologize for my behavior at last month's HOA meeting. Mrs. Morrison was simply doing her job according to community guidelines, and I overreacted to what should have been a straightforward compliance issue. Moving forward, I'm committed to being a more cooperative and understanding community member." The responses came quickly, some neighbors expressing disappointment that I'd given up, others relieved that the conflict seemed to be ending. My apparent capitulation was thoroughgoing and convincing. I removed the controversial patio chairs entirely, replacing them with approved decorative planters that contained flowers Sandra had specifically mentioned as appropriate in previous board communications. I paid the full $350 fine without protest, including a handwritten note thanking Sandra for helping me understand community standards. The note was carefully crafted to stroke her ego while creating the impression that I'd been completely broken by her superior strategy and authority. The community's reaction to my transformation was exactly what we'd hoped for. Jim shook his head sadly when he saw me working in my newly compliant garden, though he knew the truth behind my performance. Lisa avoided making eye contact when we passed each other at the grocery store. Tom Henderson sent me a private message asking why I'd given up when so many neighbors had been rooting for me. My response was perfectly crafted. "Sometimes you have to pick your battles, and this one wasn't worth the stress it was causing my family." Sandra's confidence grew daily as she watched me maintain my submissive posture. At the local coffee shop, She was overheard bragging to her friends about how she'd taught that troublemaker his place and established clear boundaries for difficult residents. Her husband, Mike, was heard saying that Sandra had finally proven she could handle the really challenging personalities in the community. The more secure Sandra felt in her victory, the more careless she became with confidential information and procedural requirements. My apparent defeat earned me something unexpected: inclusion in HOA activities. Sandra, feeling magnanimous in victory, invited me to volunteer for the community newsletter committee. The position gave me legitimate access to internal communications, draft meeting minutes, and financial summaries that would have been impossible to obtain through official channels. Sandra's trust in her own dominance made her sloppy with sensitive information, often discussing confidential matters in front of me as if I were simply part of the furniture. The breakthrough came during a pre-meeting coffee session with board members. I'd arrived early to help set up chairs, and Sandra was holding court with 2 other board members when she made the statement that would ultimately destroy her. "We need to be more aggressive with non-compliance issues," she said, apparently forgetting I was within earshot. "Some of these families need to understand they don't belong in a community with our standards." When board member Rebecca Chen expressed concern about the harshness of recent enforcement, Sandra's response was even more damning. "Rebecca, we're improving property values. If they can't afford to maintain our standards, they should move somewhere cheaper." My phone, discreetly positioned on the folding table where I was arranging papers, captured 12 minutes of conversation that revealed Sandra's true motivations and discriminatory intent. The recording included her discussion of strategic enforcement to encourage appropriate residents while pressuring problematic families to relocate. She explicitly mentioned targeting families based on their ability to afford expensive improvements rather than actual violations of community guidelines. Most damaging of all, she laughed about how emotional I'd become during the previous meeting and how easy it had been to put me in my place. Rebecca Chen's private conversation with me the following week provided another crucial piece of evidence. The board treasurer confided that she'd been uncomfortable with many of Sandra's financial decisions, but had been afraid to object publicly. Sandra threatened to review my family's compliance history when I questioned the landscape consulting payments. Rebecca told me, "I have 2 teenagers, and I can't afford to have our family targeted like yours was." Her willingness to testify about Sandra's intimidation tactics gave us the insider testimony we needed to prove systematic abuse of power. The final element of our trap was a community appreciation event that I suggested to rebuild harmony after recent tensions. Sandra loved the idea because it positioned her as the magnanimous leader bringing the community together after my disruptive behavior. She eagerly agreed to serve as the guest of honor, never suspecting that the event would become the stage for her downfall. As we planned the gathering, I made sure to invite not just residents, but also a city councilman, a local newspaper reporter, and, though Sandra didn't know it, a state investigator who'd already received our comprehensive file of evidence. The night before the appreciation event, I sat in my home office reviewing 47 pages of documentation, 8 audio recordings, and dozens of photographs that chronicled Sandra Morrison's systematic abuse of power. Tomorrow she would stand before the community as a celebrated leader, basking in what she believed was complete victory over a troublesome neighbor. She had no idea that every word she'd spoken, every dollar she'd misappropriated, and every family she'd targeted had been carefully documented by someone she thought she'd broken. In less than 24 hours, Sandra Morrison's reign of terror would end not with a bang, but with the quiet, devastating power of truth. The community appreciation event was everything Sandra Morrison could have hoped for. 43 residents gathered in the community center on a perfect Saturday afternoon, with Sandra positioned at the center of attention, wearing her favorite red HOA polo and a smile that radiated supreme confidence. I introduced her as someone who has truly transformed our community, and she basked in the applause like a politician at a campaign rally. Her 15-minute speech about tough decisions, community standards, and the importance of strong leadership was delivered with the conviction of someone who genuinely believed she was beloved by everyone present. Sandra's moment of triumph included a special recognition of my personal growth and improved community cooperation. "Mr. Ryan is a perfect example," she told the assembled crowd, "of how residents can mature and learn to work within our established systems when they're guided properly." The applause that followed felt hollow to me, but Sandra glowed with satisfaction as she publicly claimed credit for reforming my attitude. She had no idea that Sarah Martinez from the Metro Daily News was recording every word, or that state investigator James Wright was taking notes from his position near the back of the room. The first crack in Sandra's perfect day came at exactly 9:15 Monday morning. I was in my home office, watching through my window as Sandra loaded her car for what appeared to be a routine trip to the grocery store. Her phone rang, and I could see her expression change from casual confidence to confusion, then a growing alarm. Later, I learned that investigator Wright had called to schedule an interview regarding allegations of financial irregularities and procedural violations in the Willowbrook Heights HOA. Sandra's voice, according to Wright's later testimony, became increasingly shrill as she demanded to know who had made such ridiculous accusations. At 9:23, the Willowbrook Heights Community Forum exploded with activity as residents shared links to that morning's Metro Daily News article. The headline read, "Local HOA President Under Investigation for Financial Misconduct," with a subheading that detailed exclusive documentation revealing pattern of self-dealing and discriminatory enforcement. Sarah Martinez had done her homework, weaving together quotes from our recordings, financial evidence, and testimonials from affected residents into a devastating exposé that left no doubt about Sandra's systematic abuse of power. Sandra's attempt at damage control only made things worse. She called an emergency board meeting for 11 that morning, but only 3 of the 7 board members agreed to attend. Rebecca Chen publicly announced her resignation from the board, citing concerns about ethical leadership and financial transparency. The emergency meeting, held in Sandra's living room, devolved into accusations and finger-pointing as remaining board members distanced themselves from her increasingly desperate explanations. By noon, an impromptu community gathering had formed at the community center. No official meeting had been called, but residents arrived spontaneously as news of the investigation spread through the neighborhood. Jim Patterson stood up and voiced what everyone was thinking. "I think it's time for new leadership in this community." The applause was immediate and sustained. When Sandra arrived 20 minutes later, looking disheveled and desperate, she found herself facing a hostile crowd that included many of the same neighbors who had applauded her just 2 days earlier. "This meeting is not official," Sandra protested, but her authority had evaporated like morning dew. Tom Henderson read directly from the newspaper article, highlighting the $97,000 in questionable expenditures and the pattern of discriminatory enforcement. Lisa Wang stood up to describe how Sandra's targeting had affected her family's daily life. Even Mrs. Peterson, Sandra's longtime ally, remained conspicuously silent as the evidence mounted against her former friend. I entered the community center quietly and took a seat in the back, just as I had during that first confrontational meeting months earlier. Sandra spotted me immediately, and the rage in her eyes was unmistakable. "David!" she shouted, using my first name with an intimacy that felt like an invasion. "You did this, didn't you? You planned this whole thing!" The accusation hung in the air for a moment before I responded with the calm voice of someone who had waited months for this moment. "I didn't do anything, Mrs. Morrison. I just documented what you did. You betrayed my trust." Sandra continued, her voice rising to a pitch that made several residents visibly uncomfortable. "I thought we had an understanding. I thought you'd learned your lesson." My response was delivered with the kind of quiet satisfaction that comes from a perfectly executed plan. "We did have an understanding, Mrs. Morrison. You taught me about accountability. It turns out I'm a very good student." The look of realization that crossed her face told me she finally understood that her complete victory had been an illusion. The formal end of Sandra Morrison's reign came when Rebecca Chen stood up and made a motion for Sandra's immediate removal as HOA president. "Seconded," came from multiple voices around the room. The vote was 31 in favor, 2 against, with Sandra herself storming out before the count was completed. As she left, the silence that followed was broken only by the sound of her car door slamming and her BMW peeling out of the parking lot with the kind of reckless speed that perfectly captured her emotional state. The external consequences cascaded quickly after Sandra's public downfall. The IRS launched a tax investigation into the Morrison family's unreported income from property transactions. The State Bar Association opened an inquiry into Sandra's unlicensed real estate activities. City building inspectors arrived to review the emergency repairs Sandra had approved without proper permits. Each investigation built upon the others, creating a comprehensive legal siege that left Sandra with no place to hide. 6 months later, I stood in parking space number 47, officially mine once again, watching as a moving truck loaded the last of Sandra Morrison's belongings. The new HOA president was Jim Patterson, elected unanimously by a community grateful to have responsible leadership. $23,000 had been recovered from Sandra's various schemes and returned to the community fund. The Morrisons were relocating to another state, where they faced ongoing civil lawsuits from their previous victims. But victory came with its own complications. Some neighbors still avoided me, unsure whether to see me as a hero or something more dangerous. The methodical way I'd destroyed Sandra Morrison made them wonder what I might be capable of if they ever crossed me. Jim assured me that I'd simply exposed a monster rather than becoming one. But late at night, when I sat in those same patio chairs that had started it all, I sometimes wondered if there was really a difference. The final twist came in an unmarked letter I found in my mailbox on the anniversary of Sandra's departure. "Mr. Ryan," it read, "you may think you've won, but Sandra Morrison was just a small fish in a much larger pond. The real power behind property development in this area runs much deeper than a simple HOA president. Some of us have been watching. Some of us know the truth about who really controls Willowbrook Heights. Be careful who you trust." The letter was unsigned, but it carried the unmistakable tone of someone with inside knowledge. Standing there with that letter in my hands, looking out at my peaceful neighborhood where children played and families walked their dogs, I realized that Sandra Morrison's defeat might have been just the beginning of a much larger story. She'd taught me that power corrupts, but she'd also taught me that sometimes the only way to fight corruption is to become more ruthless than your enemy. As I folded the letter and slipped it into my pocket, I couldn't help but wonder. What other secrets was Willowbrook Heights hiding, and was I prepared for whatever came next?